Hello there.
Oh, right.
Good evening, everyone, and of course, welcome back to the Galactic Archives. I'm Meshla, and more than anything else, this channel is a place for long-form storytelling, settling in, and letting a narrative unfold at its own pace. And for returning again and again to characters whose lives have depth, history, and consequence. Give me 1 second. Of course I gotta find my microphone. Wait. Hold on. You guys can hear me, but my... Dude. Sorry. I'm trying to use the prompter and it's been a pain in the butt. This is what happens when I try to use technology. Hey, Foxy! And Iwakalorian, welcome in. And I think I saw an Obi-Wan Jacoby in there somewhere. Give me just a second while I try to troubleshoot what the heck is going on. Because it's telling me I have no microphone associated with my prompter. Give me just a second while I try that again. Alright, well, we might be doing this the other way because prompter is misbehaving. Oh well. I tried. I'm trying to be fancy, but sometimes it just doesn't want to work. So, we will do this the other way. Alright. Not how I wanted to this evening, but we're just gonna roll with it. I was trying to actually use the piece of software that I have, you know, because that's what it's for. Oh well. I tried. Anyway, where was I before the lack of a working prompter decided to interrupt me? Alright. Ah, here we go. Sorry. I had to find my place. Most of what I share here comes from an original Star Wars fan fiction universe that I've been building over, well, a really long time. Let's just put it that way. It has layered arcs, many interconnected stories, and a world shaped by memory, tradition, loss, loyalty, and all the quiet things that people carry with them. I've always loved stories that don't rush past the stillness, stories that let relationships deepen, let grief leave its mark, and let duty, love, and survival shape who someone becomes over time. That is really the heart of these archives. It's not only about what happens in the story, but about what it means, what it costs, and what lingers afterward. So when we gather here for story time, we're not just reading the chapter, we're stepping into a living world and spending time inside its history. The lore is a great part of that. The stories here are held together by a great deal of world building, cultures, customs, language, symbolism, military doctrine, rites of remembrance, and all of the details that help a setting feel lived in. Sometimes we spend time talking about those things directly, like we did on Sunday. Sometimes we explore them through writing workshops, where I pull back the curtain a little bit and talk about the craft, the emotional structure, the character work, and how these stories are actually built. And from time to time, we spend a few brief moments in games like SWTOR, which is another way to enjoy the galaxy that helped inspire so much of what I love. But the heart of this place is, and always will be, the stories themselves. So, whether you're here to listen, to linger in the lore, to enjoy the atmosphere, or simply to have a quiet place to land for a while, you are welcome. Please enjoy the story this evening. Tonight, we will be reading Steps into the Past, Chapter 20, called Ashes Behind the Veil. You might want to have some tissues handy, just as a warning, maybe. All right. It's been a little bit since I did the voices, so please excuse my lack of proper voice work. I'm trying. Escorting the fallen. Cure. Veil-sealed hangar bay. Deck 7. The shuttle broke atmosphere in silence, its ascent smooth as though even the air around it understood the weight that it carried. The forward veil hangar of the CSS Cure waited for them, sealed, scrubbed from the manifest and lit only by the cold white of guidance beacons. There were no spectators here, no deck crews, only those who were veil cleared, standing at their posts like silent sentinels. The deck around them empty, save for the narrow illuminated path from the shuttle's ramp to the secured lift. Metal kissed the deck as the shuttle settled into its docking cradle. The hiss of the docking clamps felt louder than it should have in the sealed hangar, but no one flinched. The hydraulic seals released with a muted thump, and then the rear ramp lowered in a controlled, measured motion. The air that spilled into the hangar was sterile and still, carrying none of the noise of a standard shuttle transfer. Directive Emberlock had stripped it to the deck plates. Greer stood in the shadowed interior of the Veil shuttle, his helmet in hand and his gaze already fixed on the line of Marines waiting at the foot of the ramp. They had assembled on the deck, leaving only Greer in the shuttle's passenger cabin. Vec, Harris, and Raoul were there along with a veil-cleared corpsman, spaced with mathematical precision, their armor plates dull and matte beneath muted lighting. They wore no insignia. There were no visible unit markings. Veil discipline was in full effect. Their posture never broke, but one by one each Marine gave the smallest acknowledgement. Raoul's gloved hand drifted once along the edge of his gauntlet as if checking its fit. Harris's chin dipped by a fraction. It was not quite a nod, and Vec's thumb brushed once at the edge of his belt, and then stilled. There was nothing a casual observer would name as a signal. Everything a veil-cleared Marine could read. Burned behind us. The thread severed. We proceed under sealed grief and active veil discipline. 2 Emberlock pods rested in the middle of the bay. They were identical, matte black, and unmarked. To an outsider, both held the fallen. But in truth, only one did. The other concealed a life behind sealed systems and layered deceptions. Marin lay inside, shrouded as though she had already joined the dead. Her vitals were masked by the pod's shielding. There were no indicator lights to betray movement or breath. Even among the veil-cleared, only a fraction knew that she still lived. Mirandy's pod bore the same weight in their eyes, the same care. They moved with the same deliberate precision as they assembled at the base of the shuttle's ramp. Here, in this silence, death was not a thing to be rushed. The order was given without a word. Beck and Harris stepped to the head of Marin's pod. Raoul and the veil-cleared corpsman mirrored them with Mirandy's. Greer descended from the shuttle last, the ramp surface thrumming faintly beneath his boots. His stride was measured to match the slow, unbroken cadence of the escort. When he reached the deck, his hand fell briefly to the near edge of Marin's pod, his fingers tightening once and releasing as if testing the friction of the casing, before moving on. Ash Escort. Escort begins under death honor discipline, maintain cadence, silence, and protection for both the living and the dead. For those who are not aware, there's a bunch of hand signals going on. So I have tried to describe them in the narrative so that you guys can kind of visualize them in your head. So that's what's going on. There was no salute, no visible sign of grief. Emberlock tolerated no cracks in its armor. Instead, their communication lived in the narrow spaces between motions. As Harris took his place at the head of Marin's pod, his fingers brushed once across the center of his palm, as though easing stiffness from his fingers. Vec answered with the same low, buried motion, his index finger dragging once across the top of his gauntlet, and then settling at the edge. Cover flow. The escort tightened around the pods without anybody seeming to move at all. Raoul's non-dominant hand pressed once against his thigh, his knuckles settling briefly as though redistributing his weight. Anchor hold. He would hold his side of the line until the order lifted. The lift waited at the end of the hangar. There was no destination panel, no call button, only a set of doors that opened at the approach of those who carried ash-level veil authorization. The interior was dim and just wide enough for the two pods to slide in side by side. As the Marines maneuvered them into place, Greer stepped inside and let his palm settle against the control panel. His thumb pressed once against the inner edge of the panel and then lifted. Ash authorization. Ash tier access confirmed. Descent to sealed deck authorized. The doors sealed with a hiss and the lift began its descent, not to Kier's public medical wing, but to the deck that officially did not exist. No one spoke. The hum of the lift was steady and slow, the kind of sound that faded into the background and into the bones until it was no longer heard, but felt. Greer kept his gaze forward, but inside he marked the moment. This was how threads ended, not with the sharp severing of combat, but the quiet erasure of those the Veil could not afford to lose. When the lift opened, the Veil medical bay waited. Sorry. The lights were set to low amber. The equipment stood ready, and every figure inside turned to receive them, each already moving with the discipline of the Veil cleared. The transfer was smooth, almost ritual. Marin's pod glided toward the far corner where her life signs would be shielded beneath layers of protocol and shadow until the medical team began their work. Mirandy's pod was taken to the chamber reserved for the fallen, the doors closing behind him with the same soft finality. In the silence that followed, Greer gave the slightest acknowledgement to those gathered. It was not a visible command, only the smallest settling of his shoulders and a brief low turn of the wrist near his thigh, as though releasing the strain of the escort from the hands that had guided it. The medical team returned it in kind. Fire still burns. The thread is gone. Continue the work. There's not gonna be a whole lot of people talking in this chapter until a little bit later, so yeah, just kind of roll with it. The quiet work. It was not... Oh, sorry. The Veil Medical Bay was built for silence. It was not the clean sterility of the public ward, where order existed for efficiency and the living were meant to recover in the open. This was a deeper stillness, the kind held by places that did not appear on any manifest and were remembered only by those cleared to enter them. The bulkheads themselves seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The lights cast a low amber glow from recessed strips, no brighter than necessary. The shadows were controlled rather than banished, and every corner was visible without ever feeling exposed. Even the air carried intention. Filtered and temperature-controlled, it smelled faintly metallic beneath the sterile bite of antiseptic and sealed systems. Marin's pod then came to rest in the center of the bay, sealed, unmarked, and indistinguishable from the one that had borne Mirandy aboard. The veil-cleared corpsemen moved without wasted motion, their faces impassive, but their eyes alive, with the unspoken awareness of what lay inside. Every gesture was precise. Nothing here was casual. Not in the way a hand settled against the guide rail of Marin's pod. Not on the angle of a medic's shoulder as he turned to receive the transfer. and not the exact spacing between the instrument tray and the pod cradle itself. Greer remained at the head of Marin's pod until the locking clamps engaged with a muted click. Only then did he step back. Even that motion was measured. He did not retreat so much as clear the space, one hand dropping low near his thighs as fingers eased once against the seam of his trousers, and then stilled. Treatment window open. Medical team has immediate priority and unobstructed access. That was enough. One of the medics moved in immediately, keying a sequence into the embedded lock panel. The gentle hiss of atmospheric equalization filled the space, as soft as a breath. Another stepped to the side rail, already reading the timing. A third moved the instrument tray closer, not because he had been told to, but because the choreography of the bay had long ago been learned by repetition and by loss. Sorry. It's actually a little... Whoops. Hold on. My camera disappeared. Hold up. One second. Oh, dear. My camera suddenly disappeared. Alright. Well, that's awkward. Sorry, guys. Give me just a second. Alright, my friends. Yeah, I don't know what that was about. Minor technical difficulties. Yes, Force Ghost. Let's go with that. Let's go with that and just leave it there. I like that. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my camera, but we'll work with it. I'm back for the moment, hopefully, so cross your fingers, my friends. Yeah. I will have to play with that before my next stream and figure out why the heck it's not working. Anyway, we're back. Hi, Lord. Welcome in. Yes, I was a forest ghost for a few seconds or a few minutes. Sorry about that. It it is not a stream unless something goes wrong. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Uh all right. Let's figure out where I was. Oh dear. Mm. All right. Yeah, we're having to do this the old-fashioned way and not use the prompter because things decided they didn't want to work. So, if it looks a little funny, that's probably why. Because my camera decided it also didn't want to work tonight. It decided it needed a vacation. But we're gonna work with that. Alright. We have an ad starting in about 5 minutes, of course. The lid of the pod lifted slowly as an antiseptic-scented mist spilled into the room. She lay as she had been placed hours earlier, still, pale, and her armor had been carefully removed and replaced with a sealed shroud. There were no wires visible. There were no openly glowing indicators. Every vital sign remained buried beneath the pod's shielding. They had made her a ghost even to their own systems until the deck was sealed. Thank you for the lurk, Permatan. I appreciate you. For one suspended moment, no one touched her. And then the work began. The shroud was peeled back in sections, revealing the raw edges of her injuries beneath it. Burns marked her face and neck as well as her arms and legs where lightning had kissed flesh. Fine cuts traced her cheekbones and jaw from the fragments of her shattered visor and debris. Bruising had already begun to darken along one shoulder and at the hollow beneath her collarbone. The medics took it all in without a word. One marked the facial damage, another tracked respiration, a third followed the trembling line of her fingers before they disappeared under the fold of the polymer shroud. Their eyes met only in brief practice acknowledgement before they moved on. A scanner hummed softly, its light sweeping from the crown of her head to her toes. The readings appeared on a shielded display. There were no projections, no shared datapad, no unnecessary visibility. The medic's eyes moved once across the numbers and then again, more slowly. His hand rose only far enough to be seen by Greer and the others inside the bay. 2 fingers settled briefly at the inside of his own wrist and then turned outward in a restrained angle before dropping again. Stable. Low reserves. Subject is holding for now, but reserves are critically low. Proceed with caution and conservation. Greer answered without taking a step closer. His hand, already low near his thigh, gave the slightest tilt, 2 fingers straightening and then relaxing again before anyone not watching for it would have noticed. Proceed. Controlled. Proceed with treatment. Controlled intervention only. The first IV was placed with care, with the tubing looped close to her skin and secured where no loose line could betray movement or create drag if the pod needed to be shifted quickly. The drip began silently. Another medic arranged a tray, back to injectors, dermal sealants, and a compact field unit for neural stabilization, narrow-cut dressing strips, and a micro-regenerator. Each item was placed with the same precision as one might seat rounds into a rifle's magazine. No one reached across another's hands. No one blocked access. The medics worked with the tight economy of motion of those who knew exactly how close to the edge a body could be, and still be recoverable. When they started to work on the wounds on her face, it was without haste. One medic cupped the back of her head gently in a gloved palm, careful of the angle of her neck. Another guided the regenerator beam along the worst of the burns, the unit's faint whine nearly lost beneath a deeper thrum beneath the deck plates. Tissue knit slowly. It was not clean, and not all at once, but it was enough to stop the body from losing more of itself than it already had. The smell shifted as they worked, ozone and scorched skin giving way to antiseptic vapor and heated back to mist. Greer remained close, but he was never inside the arc of their hands. He held himself in the same disciplined stillness as the others, though there was nothing passive in his posture. He kept count. The seconds between each glance toward the hidden vitals, the slight rise and fall of her chest. The pulse at her throat was faint enough to vanish if he watched it too closely. The way one medic paused longer over the neural readout than over the burns, and the way another rechecked the IV line placement at her wrist after noticing a tremor in her fingers. And I'm going to stop there because we have an ad starting in about 30 seconds. Oh, I'm going to take a stretch. Those ad breaks are a minute and a half, so please take the opportunity to go get yourself a drink of water, grab a snack, hug your kids, hug your wife, hug your pets, any of the above. I will see you guys back here in a minute and a half, or a little bit longer. Go take a break. I'll be back. Alright, my friends, we are back from that ad break. I see you, the sniper. Welcome in. I hope you're doing well this evening. Alright. And please feel free to yell at me if you see me slouching or leaning too far forward, that kind of thing. That's what the commands are there for. Please feel free to use them, but don't abuse them. Use them gently. That's why they're there. At the far side of the bay, Harris had taken up a position just inside the sealed hatch. He didn't face inward fully. His attention was split evenly between the room and the hatch, his weight resting evenly on the balls of his feet and his shoulders loose. Ral held the opposite side of the room in mirror discipline, the distance between them creating its own kind of wall. Neither spoke. Neither of them needed to. The bay itself was sealed, but Emberlock did not rely on locks alone. Ral's hand drifted once across his wrist as if soothing an itch inside his gloves. 2 fingers drew inward and rested there a beat. Status holds. Position holds. No external disruption. Maintain current watch. Harris answered in kind. His index finger traced a half arc against the inside of his opposite wrist before his hand settled again. Confirm. Status received and maintained. Near the pod, the neural readout shifted. It was not dramatic, and not enough to change the breathing pattern or disturb the low drip at her wrist. But one medic saw it immediately. His gloved hand moved to the back of his own wrist, 3 fingers splaying and closing twice in succession as if checking the stiffness of his fingers. Pattern shift. Internal pattern shift detected. Monitor for irregular neurological or non-physical fluctuation. Greer saw it. So did Raoul. Neither of them spoke. The next few seconds stretched. A medic adjusted the neural interface at Marin's temple, reseating the sensor film by less than a finger's width. Another watched the line at her throat, and yet another reviewed the numbers again and kept them to himself. When they moved to fit the neural stabilizer, one medic glanced at Greer for confirmation. Greer's answer was minimal. 2 fingers rose no higher than his own wrist, held, and then pressed lightly together before separating again. Light dose only. Minimal neural intervention. Stabilize without suppressing further than necessary. It was enough. The medic adjusted the unit accordingly. The dosage was low. The contact points were placed with care. One at the temple, another at her collarbone, and yet another hidden beneath the edge of the shroud. The machine emitted a low, nearly inaudible hum as it came online. Marin didn't wake. She didn't visibly react, but the line of strain at her forehead eased by a fraction, and that was enough for the medic nearest her shoulder to continue. Minutes passed. The room remained sealed. The only sounds were from the tools of their trade and the muted rhythm of breathing. One dressing was removed, another fresh one replaced it. A burn was sealed, an IV line checked. The work remained quiet because it had to. Not only because of veil protocol, but because everything in the room was carefully balanced, and noise would have been an insult to the precision being asked of flesh and hands alike. At last, the lead medic stepped back. He didn't straighten fully. He only let his weight settle and then touched 2 fingers once to his sternum and then lowered them toward Marin. Subject will hold. Immediate collapse no longer expected. The air in the room seemed to ease around them, though no one acknowledged it aloud. They drew the shroud back over her, this time not to hide her, but to keep the cool air from settling against burned skin and depleted reserves. The IV line was routed neatly beneath the shroud. One medic set the portable monitor at the head of the pod. Its display dimmed nearly to black from outside the arc of her hair. Another checked the line again. Another locked the treatment window in a dead screen unit that would never leave the sealed bay. Only when everything was in place did Greer let himself move closer. His eyes met the medic's in a final acknowledgement. The motion that passed between them was hardly a motion at all. His shoulder settling once and one wrist easing outward and returning to neutral. Not grief. Not relief. A continuation. The fire still burns. Yeah, I'm slouching. Alright. In the absence of signal. Tanagas 5, hangar, evening. The kata usually brought him focus. The old forms had been drilled into him until every movement carried its own memory, muscle, breath, and thought moving as one through a pattern so deeply ingrained that it required no conscious effort. Under normal circumstances, the sequence settled him. It gave his frustration somewhere to go besides inward. It gathered his loose thoughts and fed them back into the discipline until the noise inside him quieted. Today, though, it kept catching. Not badly. Not enough that another student would have named it a mistake at first glance. But Jared felt every flaw. A half-second hesitation at the turn. A breath where there should not have been one. A tiny drag in the angle of his shoulders when he shifted weight from one foot to the other. The final arc of the form lacked its usual certainty. He felt it before he finished, knew it while he was still moving through it, and still carried the motion through to completion because stopping halfway through would have felt worse than finishing badly. The hilt turned once in his palm before he thumbed it off. Silence settled over the hanger again. The kata was not as smooth as it should have been. He knew it. The faint frown pulling at his mouth was not from the misstep alone. Sweat traced down the side of his face. He swiped at it with the hem of his tunic sleeve and dropped to one knee in the center of the worn stone floor, holding still for a moment as if stillness alone might restore the balance the kata had failed to provide him. Around him, the hangar settled into its usual evening quiet. Tools sat where they had been left. The workbench held the half-familiar clutter of practical lives, coiled cables, spare fittings, a neatly folded oilcloth, and a datapad resting dark beside a tray of small parts. Beyond the hangar apron, the forest stood in the deepening wash of dusk, the trees darkening slowly as the sun slipped lower. The air smelled faintly of stone, machine oil, old metal, and the clean chill that came down off the mountain once the sun began to set. There was no proper master's wheel here. No inlaid lines, no designated training circle marked with the kind of care the Praxium gave to such things. Not yet. Marin had mentioned the idea months ago, her voice carrying that quiet half-smile she sometimes wore when imagining something she meant to build with her own hands. She had pointed out the far alcove of the hangar as a good place for an open sparring circle. The estate already had a training room in the lower levels, but it still wasn't fully restored, and she often used the hangar when she wanted space, privacy, or just quicker access. It wasn't too close to the tools, and there was plenty of clearance overhead, and a good footing if the stone was cut and smoothed properly. He could still hear the practical certainty in her tone, as though the thing already existed and she was only waiting for the right moment. That had been before she had left for her marine billet, before she had been back, just once, for those few fleeting days that Connors had managed to carve out for her. And then she was gone again. Jared let out a slow breath, forcing it deep into his center and trying to feed his frustration into the current of the force and let it disperse instead of clinging to him. Normally, that was enough. Normally, the act of naming the unrest in his own mind gave him leverage over it. He didn't try to push. He only listened. The echo came back muted, unfocused. It wasn't absence. That's what bothered him the most. It was there, but wrong in shape, as if what he was sensing had been wrapped in too many layers to reach him clearly, as if something had drawn tight around it and left him only the pressure of what was missing. Something's bothering you. The voice from the shadowed corner of the hangar didn't startle him. Jared had already felt the steady, watchful presence against the edge of his awareness. He turned his head slightly toward it and found Ethan leaning against the workbench, his arms folded, his expression unreadable in the low light. Jared rose and crossed the floor, his steps quiet on the worn stone. Ethan shifted just enough to make space, but didn't move from his lean against the workbench. Jared swung himself up onto the stool beside the bench, hooking his boots on the lower rung. His posture was controlled, but tight in ways he knew that Ethan would see whether he wanted him to or not. Ethan didn't push. He never did, not unless it became necessary. That was one of the things that Jared respected about him. Ethan had known Marin a long time, longer than Jared had even been in her orbit, long enough to read her without needing the Force, long enough to understand what silence meant, when it was chosen and when it was imposed, and long enough to know that there were some kinds of restraint that looked like composure, until you knew what they cost. The quiet stretched. It was not awkward, but waited. "I haven't heard from her since she left last time," Jared said at last. His voice was low, but the strain threaded through it was unguarded. Ethan's brown eyes narrowed slightly. "Strangely, neither have I," he replied after a beat. "She usually gets a calm out here once a month if she can. After the attack on the colony, I can't say I'm surprised." He let the thought hang between them for a moment, unfinished. But that single word carried enough. Jared exhaled through his nose and rubbed at his forehead before letting his hand fall open again. A small, polished blue stone rested in his palm, catching the low hangar light. He turned it with his thumb, the motion habitual now, something between an anchor and a restless tell. The image of Marin turning Jerry's tags over in her fingers was in his mind for a moment, and he sighed. "This feels like more than calm silence," he said. "I've learned to give her space when I know she's on a mission. I know what that costs her, and I know she does better when people don't crowd her from a distance." He looked down at the stone as it rolled once beneath his thumb. "But for the last few days, I've had this feeling, like she's out of reach, but not gone, just..." He frowned, searching for the right words. "Farther than she should be." He hesitated and added more quietly, "I can't shake it." Ethan studied him closely. "It's not a good time to try reaching Catane directly," he said carefully, "not with everything shifting the way it has." His gaze stayed on Jared's face. "But have you spoken with Card?" "I did." Jared's jaw worked for a moment. "That's what makes it even stranger. He couldn't sense much more than I could, and usually he's far sharper than I am in that regard." He paused, and then frowned faintly. "Maybe it's because of the connection she and I have." The words didn't satisfy him, and Ethan could hear it in his voice. Jared rolled the stone once more between his fingers, and then let out a breath that sounded more like resignation than doubt. "Or maybe it's because I'm not trying to reach her the way Mr. Card would," he said quietly. "He listens for her balance, her center, for the way she holds herself in the current." His mouth tightened slightly. That's what he taught her to do. Ethan's attention sharpened, not in challenge, but in recognition. "I don't know how she would feel when everything's right," Jared continued. "Not the way he would. I don't know her with that kind of clarity." He lifted the stone slightly and then lowered it again. "I only know what it feels like when she's pushing through something she won't name, when she's carrying pain and refuses to let it spill outward." His thumb stilled against the smooth surface of the stone. "That's what this feels like. Not absence. Suppression." "Good evening, Shadow Legion. Welcome in." I'm over here being all serious and reading. He finally looked up and met Ethan's gaze. "She's holding herself very still," he said, "and she only does that when she's hurt." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded once. "You think she's in trouble," he said. It was not a question. "You're fine, don't worry about it. I'm glad to see you back." Jared didn't answer immediately. He didn't really need to. The tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers had gone still around the stone, the set of his mouth, all of it answered for him. "There are only a few reasons she'd do that," Ethan said at last. Jared inclined his head slightly. A grim understanding passed between them. Stefan would not force past a boundary like that. Jared knew it. And it was not because the Jedi Master was weak, but because he was disciplined enough to stop where others might justify reaching farther. Ethan gave voice to the thought a moment later. "Card wouldn't reach for her if she pulled the veil tight," he said. "He listens for alignment, for clarity. If she's fragmented or deliberately shutting herself down, he'll respect that." He paused. "Even if it costs him certainty." "That's why it worries me," Jared replied. "Even if he can't get a clean sense of her, then whatever she's dealing with isn't something she can afford to let touch the current." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms braced against his knees and his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the bench and the tools and the dim stretch of hangar floor. "But I don't need clarity to know when something's wrong," he said. "I just need to know how far she's pulling away." Ethan watched him for a long moment and then inclined his head once, in a small, deliberate nod. "You're not imagining this," he said. "And you're not overstepping by naming it, either." Jared's shoulders eased slightly. "She's learned how to survive by narrowing her world," Ethan continued. When things get bad enough, she doesn't broadcast, she conserves. His voice stayed even, but there was old knowledge under it, and older anger directed somewhere far beyond the hangar walls. It pressed faintly but firmly against Jared's senses. I know her well enough to know that that kind of silence doesn't echo cleanly in the Force, even if I can't sense it to myself. His gaze hardened, but people who know her well can still feel the shape of it. That earned a quiet, humorless huff from Jared. I wish I didn't. Ethan pushed off the workbench and then moved to stand beside him. One calloused hand settled briefly on Jared's shoulder, firm and grounding in a way that didn't ask him to be less troubled than he was. "That's why I trust your read of the situation," he said simply. "You're not trying to pull her back. You're just standing watch." He left his hand there only a moment before letting it fall away. "Jate," he added after a beat. "We'll assess her condition when she's home, and we'll decide what to do then. Until that moment, hold your ground here. I'll let Kel know what you told me." Jared nodded silently. There was not much else that he could say to that. No argument that would help, no reassurance that either of them would trust if it came too easily. He listened to Ethan's footsteps fade down the hall, the sound swallowed quickly by the hangar's stillness. For a moment he stayed where he was, the blue stone still resting in his palm, warm now from the pressure of his hand. And then he slid down from the stool and crossed to the hangar apron, lowering himself to sit on the permacrete threshold with his elbows resting on his knees, and his blue eyes turned toward the forest beyond. The trees stood dark and patient in the evening light. Marin had always found peace among them. He hoped that he could, too. If not peace, then something close enough to hold him steady, until the veil lifted enough for him to see her again. For a long time, he didn't move. The stone remained in his hand, the forest breathed beyond the threshold. And somewhere far beyond Tanagas, the absence he felt did not ease, but it did settle into something he could finally name. Not loss. Not yet. A line held. A silence under strain. And so he sat, not reaching, not forcing, and doing the only thing left to him. Standing watch from a distance. Okay, I'm gonna pause and get a drink of water. Voicing is hard. All right. Stillness within the veil. Cure. Veil-sealed medical bay, deck 7. The cradle locks were shut around the antigrav pod, its matte black shell opened just far enough for the medics to work. The light inside the sealed bay was muted, sterile, and nearly without shadow. Designed to leave no corner unseen, no details hidden, and no movement unaccounted for. Every surface held the low amber wash of recessed strips set deep into the bulkheads. They were enough to illuminate the work without warming it. Even the air was controlled, filtered, and chilled just enough to preserve clarity in hands and thought alike. Every movement in the room carried the weight of Kash Veyran, the ritual of the unseen, the unspoken discipline that bound veil-cleared personnel to the silence they wore like armor. No voices rose here. No names left their lips as Emberlock doctrine demanded. Marin lay motionless within the pod, her breathing shallow but steady beneath the hum of life support and the soft tick of intravenous pumps. Strips of biosensor film clung to her temples, wrists, and collarbone, feeding a constant stream to the sealed hollow panel mounted on the head of the stabilization cradle. Her vitals pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each line of data scrolling under the security hash of Emberlock. Nothing here existed outside the deck's memory. There were no data relays that reached beyond a Veil-secured databank. No medbay log beyond Ash Tier would ever acknowledge that she had crossed this threshold alive. Even the angles of the display had been chosen to bury information from any who were not meant to see it. They had made her a ghost so completely that only the body itself still betrayed the fact that she remained among the living. Harris stood guard by the sealed hatch, his posture locked in Durrell Cayenne, shield of the witness, broad enough to deny the line without ever seeming to challenge it. His eyes tracked the bulkheads, the upper catwalk, the hatch controls, and then back again, a pattern too disciplined to be repetitive. Raoul mirrored him from the opposite side of the bay, his stance as quiet and fixed as a durasteel beam driven into load-bearing stone. The faint shift of his left hand brushed the side of his gauntlet, in a motion so casual it might have passed as easing pressure from his gloves. 2 fingers drew inward. His thumb then settled against the side of his palm and held there. Status holds. No breach, no motion, no external disruption. Maintain present watch. Harris answered without turning his head. His left index finger traced a restrained half arc across the inside of his right wrist before his hand settled back to the seam of his trousers. Confirm. Current watch maintained. We have an ad starting in about 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Near the pod, one of the medics adjusted the neural interface at Marin's temple. The readings had shifted. Not sharply enough to resemble a pain spike, and not widely enough to suggest environmental fluctuations. The activity had instead taken on a subtle, sustained rise in cortical patterning. Something folded inward, irregular and self-looping, as if the mind beneath the sensors had turned down a corridor no one else in the room could see. Pale blue arcs climbed and fell across the hollow panel in a sequence that meant nothing the medics in a standard ward would have named urgent. But every trained eye in the room tightened around it anyway. The medic's gloved hand drifted to the back of his own wrist. 3 fingers splayed and closed twice in measured succession before dropping away again. Pattern shift. Internal pattern shift detected. Monitor for deviation from known physiological response. Raoul's gaze flicked toward Harris. His arm remained loose at his side, but his thumb tapped once against his little finger. Not physical. Irregularity does not present as purely physical trauma or ordinary bodily distress. There was another slow spike, and then another, longer. The neural echo looped back on itself, pale blue arcs folding inward as though her thoughts were moving through a sealed passage with no visible door. One medic encrypted the pattern under a closed diagnostic tag. Another checked the neural stabilizer. Yet another rechecked the sedation line. None of them found a physical cause sufficient to explain what they were seeing. The room remained silent, but the silence sharpened. Yay! I'm glad it worked. Welcome in, Zenny. Take this moment to take a stretch. Oh, goodness. I'm locking in, so I'm leaning forward a little bit. Sorry. Oh, good. I didn't realize she was either. Yes, all of the comfy vibes. Alright. We have an ad starting in about 2 minutes and 22 seconds. Greer stood on the pod's left side, one hand resting lightly against the pod's edge, his thumb pressed once into his palm. His fingers wrapped slowly and deliberately over the lip of the stabilization cradle before releasing. Hold the line until return. Maintain current line and do not intervene. Hold position until the subject returns on her own. His gaze did not leave her face. Outside of the pod, the room remained locked in engineered stillness. Inside, somewhere unseen, something else had a hold of her. No one in the sealed bay could follow where she had gone. Only the slow, deliberate rise and fall of her chest marked the passage of time. But in the space behind her closed eyes, another world waited. Okay. This is actually going to be a long, extended scene, so just kind of bear with me a little bit. But we have about 1 minute and 15 until our ad. So, oh. Well, that's cool. So I will read the first paragraph, and I will stop there for Ed. The first thing that Jared felt was resistance. Not distance, exactly. Resistance, like wading into a current that refused his entry. The force was present and alive, but something in it dragged him sideways, tugging at his balance and refusing to settle. He slowed instinctively, breath deepening and his posture softening the way Master Card had drilled into him when the current turned treacherous. Don't push. Let it meet you. Jared let his hands fall open at his sides. He didn't reach. The pull answered anyway. And I'm actually going to stop right there because I do not want to stop in the middle of a sentence. So, yeah. We're going to pause there and wait for our ad break. Please take this time to go get yourselves a drink of water, have a stretch, grab a snack. And thank you for coming in, Zenny. And for anybody else who came along with you. I will see you guys back in a minute and a half. All right, my friends, we are back from our ad break. Yes, always with the suspense. Sorry, Foxy. Like I said, I try not to end in the middle of a sentence. Also, Ajo, sir, thank you so much for that 20-month subscription. I appreciate you. You don't have to do that, but I appreciate it anyway. The pull answered anyway. It tugged at him the way gravity did, quiet, inescapable, and bending the world until standing still became impossible. The hangar, the stone beneath his feet, and the distant hum of Tanagas beyond the walls thinned and slipped away, replaced by cold. It was not the clean cold of mountain air, but something industrial and metallic, heavy with rust, coolant, and old smoke. The scent hit first, coating his lungs, followed by the low, indifferent hum of systems that didn't care whether anyone lived or died inside their walls. Yes, that is kind of the point. Jared's breath stuttered. He was not watching Marin. He was inside her memory. She knelt against the Durasteel wall, her wrists and ankles locked by magnetic restraints that bit into bone. The position was wrong, forced, punishing, and engineered to exhaust without leaving obvious marks. Her head hung forward, her chin brushing the torn collar of her fatigues. Dried blood had crusted along her temple and jaw. Each shallow breath scraped, her ribs grinding with pain she refused to acknowledge. Jared felt it, then, the ache beneath everything else, rhythmic and relentless. Pain calibrated to last. He took a step without realizing it. The vision resisted, stretched, and held him in place. This was not a place for interference. This was witnessing. The air shifted. A presence entered the space, and the force recoiled, compressing inward as if a flame had been smothered beneath a veil. Cold prickled along Jared's skin, deliberate and familiar, the kind of pressure that came not from rage, but from control. He knew the feeling. He had felt it once before, distantly on Galan. Marin didn't look up as the Chiss woman stepped into view, her red eyes catching the light as she knelt in front of her. She wore no armor. She didn't need it. The weight she carried pressed down on the room all on its own. Marin's silence was not defiance. It was discipline. The Chiss lifted one gloved hand and lightning bloomed from her fingers. It struck with precision, arcing across Marin's chest and torso and crawling deliberately over old burns that flared anew beneath the assault. Pain spread outward, raw and blinding, dragging a broken sound from Marin's throat before she could choke it back. The scent of ozone flooded the space. Jared felt her body strain against the restraints, her muscles locking as electricity tore through nerves already pushed past endurance. The force buckled and then fractured. Static roared. Marin reached for the current on instinct and hit something wrong. It was not absence. It was not even silence. It was resistance. The force was still there, close enough to feel, but twisted, chemical, hostile, and punishing her every attempt to grasp it. Nausea surged hard enough to force the air from her lungs. Oops, sorry. I can't read. Vertigo pitched her world sideways until the Durasteel wall felt impossibly far away. Pain is a moment. Ethan's voice surfaced from Marin's memory, steady, even here. Do not let them own it. The Chiss leaned closer, her voice low and even, hissing questions through the haze of pain. Fleet numbers, patrol strength, response times. Marin locked her jaw and said nothing. When the lightning struck again, she endured it the same way she had endured the first, anchored in pain because pain, at least, was hers. When the Chiss finally rose, it was without urgency. Leave her, she ordered. We'll see how long conviction lasts when the body forgets it. The door hissed closed. Time did not pass cleanly after that. It fractured, light and dark slipping out of order, sounds without meaning, awareness flickering beneath pain and the chemical fog. She remembered the restraints releasing, but not clearly. Rough hands held her upright. There was a hiss of an injector at her neck before cold seeped into her veins. After that, the world broke apart. She did not remember leaving the facility in any coherent way. Only the injector, the collapse, and the broken return of sensation once she was already outside. Weightlessness followed by impact, the jolt of her boots touching the ground before her knees failed beneath her. When awareness returned again, it did not return whole. Ash and grit bit into her palms. Her body was already on the ground, her breathing shallow, her ribs scraping with each breath. The force hovered close, but it was wrong, warped and jagged and punishing every instinctive reach towards it. Static surged. Nausea twisted hard through her gut. Whatever they had injected her with had been not meant to kill her. It had been meant to cripple her, to strip away what had made her dangerous without leaving the obvious damage behind. She tried to rise, and failed, so she crawled. The ground stayed too close as she dragged herself forward through ash and debris, each movement tearing against the pain already driven too deep to name. At the edge of her vision, shapes shifted in and out of the haze. They were never close enough to strike, but never distant enough to dismiss either. Whether they were still there in truth or only the last pressure of pursuit burning through the fog of the sedative, she couldn't tell. But the effect was the same. Every time she veered too far, dread and instinct shoved her back toward the faint perimeter lights ahead. They were not chasing her. They were hurting her. The realization hit with a sick clarity as the distant perimeter lights bled through the haze, impossibly far at first, and then slowly closer. Her arms shook violently now, her shoulders screaming as she crawled on through the sheer refusal to stop. Sweat chilled on her skin, and the exhaustion pressed down harder than the pain. Keep going. The thought was thin and frayed, but it held. She dragged herself forward across another stretch of open ground and finally understood something worse. They expected her to make it. The pressure eased as she crossed the last few meters, the silhouettes falling back, their interest waning. They were not concerned with whether she survived, only with where she would end up if she did. Careful hands reached for her at the perimeter. Voices cut through the static in her mind, urgent, sharp, and suddenly familiar. Oh no! Well, welcome back. Relief flared, then a name. Her name was spoken aloud. Marin froze. The vision tilted violently, the sound echoing far too loudly in her ears. Jared felt the instant of dread that followed. It was not abstract or delayed. It was immediate and certain. That was a mistake. The force lurched, twisting sharply to one side as if warning her too late. The next few moments blurred. Movement, confusion, a concussive crack that punched the air out of her lungs. Everything pitched sideways as a weight slammed into her, heavy and warm, and suddenly unmoving. Blood. There was too much blood. Dark canvas filled her vision, the smell of blood sharp and metallic beneath the lingering ozone. A body pressed over hers, shielding her without hesitation, without question. Mirandi. The name surfaced with crushing clarity. Grief spiked so sharply it nearly tore through the chemical fog in her brain. She tried to move, tried to scream, but her body refused as it was pinned beneath the sudden stillness of a man who would never move again. Jared felt something worse than pain. The certainty that this death had been meant for her. The static surged once more, drowning out everything as the vision began to tear at the edges, the memory buckling under too much loss and grief layered too close together. The thread between them trembled, but it did not break. The vision didn't end with the gunshot. It folded inward. Sound dulled first, then light, until everything narrowed to sensation alone. Heat against Marin's back where Mirandy's body shielded her. The unbearable weight of his stillness, the copper tang filling her nose as blood soaked through fabric to her skin. She couldn't move. Her limbs refused every command, her nerves still misfiring beneath the compound's grip. The force hovered just beyond her reach, close enough to mock her, warped and jagged where it should have flowed smoothly. Each instinctive attempt to touch it ended the same way, vertigo slamming through her skull and nausea curling hard in her gut, the static roaring in her mind. Stay. Don't reach. Don't break. Careful hands pulled Mirandy's weight away at last, but there were no voices rising in controlled urgency. The pressure eased, but the absence it left behind was worse. It was too sudden, too final. The med tent ceiling swam above her, the seams in the canvas blurring as if the world itself were dissolving. Jared felt her awareness slipping away again, not falling, withdrawing. The noise faded. The pain receded to a distant ache. Even the static eased a fraction, leaving behind a strange, hollow quiet that felt nothing like peace. Then the saber surfaced. Not as an object at first, as a wrongness felt within the force. There was a tug at the edge of her awareness, familiar, intimate, but suddenly alien. Her lightsaber lay nearby, stripped from her belt with the rest of her gear, its presence dim but insistent. She reached for it without thinking, more habit than actual intent, and flinched at the immediate recoil. The connection between them stuttered. Jared felt the fracture ripple outward as Marin's focus sharpened despite the haze. Something inside the saber was wrong. It wasn't silent. It definitely wasn't inactive. It was misaligned. The resonance that should have hummed steadily and true instead wavered, jittery and unstable like a damaged power conduit sparking behind a sealed panel. She forced her awareness closer, carefully this time, skirting the edges of the static rather than pushing through it. There. The crystal. Jared saw it as she did, not whole, but spiderwebbed with the cracks from within, a deliberate fracture running through its very heart. The crack was not the chaotic damage of a weapon being struck or mishandled. It was precise, intentional, made to weaken the blade without shattering. And embedded deep inside was a foreign object. It was cold, it was mechanical, and it was patient, if such things could be that. A tracker. The realization snapped into place with brutal clarity. Whoever had placed it had not been content simply to follow her movements. They had altered the saber itself, turned it into a liability and a trap, waiting to be sprung. Marin's breath hitched as understanding followed instinct. If she had died on Druckenwell, the saber had been recovered, passed on, and activated by someone else. The thought cut off sharply, her mind recoiling from the implications before they could even fully form. Jared felt the echo of it anyway, a hard certainty tightening painfully in his chest. This had not been aimed only at her. Her hands moved weakly, her fingers trembling as she disengaged the power cell with more care than speed. The moment the energy source separated from the rest of the components, the saber's presence dulled in the force, and the malignant tension eased slightly. She worked the tracker free next, her movements clumsy but determined, refusing to leave it embedded any longer. The crack in the crystal remained. It was a wound that could not be repaired. Exhaustion slammed into her all at once, heavier than before, dragging her down as the last of her strength bled away. Her grip loosened, the world tilted. Somewhere nearby, someone activated a haptic transceiver. Jared felt the vibrations through his teeth, but they came through wrong, distant, distorted, and stripped of meaning. Jared felt the threads strain. Marin's consciousness drifted outward, unmooring from pain and from a body that would no longer obey. The med tent faded around them, replaced by a vast, dim space that felt neither here nor elsewhere, and in between, held together by memory and will alone. Jared remembered her describing the vision space she often found herself in when facing an important lesson. But this was not that. That was when Marin realized she was not alone. Jared's presence brushed against hers, familiar, steady, and unmistakably him. It was not intrusive, nor demanding. It was just there, anchoring her to something solid when everything else threatened to dissolve around her. You found me. The thought surfaced, fragile, yet certain. The thread tightened, not enough to bind, but enough to hold. The space around them steadied. Not because the pain had faded, but because something else had arrived. Jared was no longer only watching. He knelt beside her in the suspended quiet, close enough now that the thread between them no longer strained. Marin's awareness flickered, fractured around the edges and slipping toward that dangerous threshold where the body could no longer tell the difference between rest and disappearance. Jared reached out, not with the force, but with something older. His hand moved deliberately at his side, his fingers easing outward in a slow, controlled release. It was almost nothing to an untrained eye, but Marin felt it anyway. Keserim. Her breathing stuttered and then found a fragile rhythm. I've got you, Jared said quietly, his voice low and steady. Stay with me. Marin felt the anchor take hold. Because she felt it, she could finally speak. It wasn't supposed to end there, she said. Not aloud, but into the shared current between them. Her voice carried strain, but not fear. They didn't come to kill me on Dragonwell. Jared didn't interrupt. His presence remained open, yet contained. They needed me alive, she continued. They wanted information, numbers, fleet strength, how many ships we could bring to bear, and how quickly. There was a weighted pause. They weren't in a hurry. That was the worst part. Her memories stirred, but this time they didn't overwhelm her. She guided them, choosing what to release and what to hold close. They used lightning, Marin said, carefully. Enough to hurt, enough to keep me conscious, and then the injection, whatever it was, turned the force against me. Every time I tried to reach for it, it punished me. Static, nausea. It's like grabbing a live wire through torn gloves. Jared felt the residue of it, not as pain, exactly, but as wrongness that prickled across his awareness. I lost time, she admitted. There are gaps. I don't know if that means they took something from me or if my body just couldn't keep up. Her presence wavered and then steadied. I don't remember giving them anything, but I can't promise you they didn't take it anyway. Jared shifted slightly, grounding himself, and then traced a slow palm-down motion between them. A silent hold, care-modulated rather than command-hard, closer in spirit to the recovery uses than to a field order. He didn't need to make it a named signal for her to feel what it meant. Hold here. Lean if you need to. Marin felt it anyway, and continued. They let me go, she said. Guided. Herded. They wanted me to reach our perimeter. They wanted to see what would happen next. The image surfaced between them, her crawling through ash and debris, the silhouettes that never quite closed in, always steering, but never striking. They were still watching when I crossed the perimeter, and someone inside the camp made a mistake. Her presence tightened. My name was spoken. Not long after, someone fired into the tent. A quiet beat passed. Morendi died because of me. The grief settled between them, dense and heavy. Jared didn't try to soften it. Instead, he held it with her. There was a tracker, Marin said at last, embedded in the central crystal of my lightsaber. The memory surfaced again, the spider-webbed fracture deliberate and precise. The crystal was already cracked. Not from damage. From intent. Understanding settled between them. If I hadn't noticed it, she said. If someone else had activated the saber later, she stopped there and let the implications stand. It wasn't safe. Whatever they were planning, it didn't end with Drakenwell. Jared lifted his hand once more, 2 fingers brushing briefly against his eyebrow before lowering again. Ghostwatch. I don't know who did this, Marin said quietly. I don't know how many were involved, and I don't trust my memories enough to draw lines that aren't there. She paused, and then continued even softer. I need you to know what happened, not so you can fix it, but so you can stand watch. Jared finally spoke, his voice steady and certain. I won't look away. Relief rippled through her. It was not warm, it was not fleeting, but it was steadier than fear. The space around them began to thin. The memories loosened their grip, dissolving not into nothing, but into distance, catalogued, held, and ready to be carried later when she was strong enough. The thread didn't break as consciousness slipped away. It slackened gently rather than snapping, guiding her back towards breath and body and the waiting quiet of the medbay. Jared stayed with her until the last moment, until the vision released him and the full weight of what he had witnessed settled into his chest. Only then did he let his hand fall still. The pod's internal system cycled once, a faint change in tone as if closing a chapter. The medics withdrew together, each motion deliberate, and their gloves leaving no trace against the pod's matte surface. The neural interface remained, but its readout had settled into the steady cadence of baseline vitals. There were no further spikes, no anomalies that the sensors could capture. Ral had held his position at the inner bulkhead, his posture unchanged, but his eyes followed every adjustment on the monitor. He didn't ask questions. Under Emberlock, questions were luxuries, and luxuries left trails. One of the medics let his hand settle low against the edge of the cradle, his fingers curling once and releasing before he drew back. Stabilized. Monitoring. Subject stabilized for now. Continue observation. No immediate intervention required. Greer gave no reply beyond a slow, single nod. He remained at the pod's side, his gloved fingers still resting lightly against the edge. It was not comfort. Emberlock left little room for such things, but it was an unspoken tether all the same. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes. The bay lights dimmed slightly, a program shift signaling transition from intervention to observation. The antigrav pod stayed locked in its stabilization cradle, the cover still open to allow ongoing treatment. Every diagnostic relay fed into a sealed archive no one outside Ash Tier would ever access. Outside the hatch, Vex's stance shifted by a fraction, enough to ease the long hold without breaking his posture. His hand brushed once down over his belt toward the hip and stopped there. Shadow shift. The corridor beyond stayed empty. There were no footsteps approaching. There were no shadows that moved. Inside, the silence held. It was not an absence of sound, but the sharpened quiet of watchfulness, the kind that could burn through hours without yielding to fatigue. They would keep her here, unseen, until the next step started, until the veil decided that it was time to move. Okay. Oh, I need water. Give me one sec. Oh, okay. Echo on the thread. It's in August 5, Durza Estate. The air in the hangar was heavy with the muted hum of standby systems, the kind of sound that settled into the bones wherein silence had already claimed everything else. Jared wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting on the hangar apron, but the light had shifted. Long shadows cut between the support beams. The sun had begun to drop behind the tree line, and the forest beyond the threshold had gone still in that way that felt less like peace than suspension, as though the world were holding its breath and waiting to see what would happen next. He sat with his elbows on his knees and the echo of the vision still burning behind his eyes. The permacrete beneath him held the day's warmth only faintly now. A breeze moved through the hangar mouth and died there, unable to carry the tension out with it. Somewhere deeper in the estate, a system cycled and then fell quiet again. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud in the open bay, roughened by what he had seen and by the effort of holding it together long enough to give it a name. A deep breath steadied him only slightly. When he finally tried to rise, the stone floor swayed under his feet. Hands caught his arm before he could stumble. Steady, calloused, and familiar. Ethan. A heartbeat later came the faint, cooling brush through the forest as Callista reached him from the other side. She was not probing or pressing, just reading the instability before it had time to spill into a full collapse. Jared blinked up at them, his vision lagging behind recognition. Ethan's brown eyes were already scanning. His posture, breathing, pupils, the angle of his shoulders, the delay in his focus while Callista's attention slid carefully inward, reading the tremor that still hadn't left his center. Ethan's left index finger brushed once along the edge of his vambrace toward the wrist, and then tapped twice on his inner forearm in a motion quiet enough to pass for resetting his grip, if someone hadn't known what to watch for. Stand by. Secure perimeter. Hold steady. Secure the immediate space. No intrusion while assessment begins. Callista answered with no more than a slow curl of her ring finger toward her palm as her hand rested low at her side. Acknowledged. Inner watch. I am holding inward watch and will maintain calm perimeter on the subject. Together, they eased him back until his spine rested against the hangar bulkhead. Jared's fingers trembled when he braced them on his knees, his breathing controlled, yet thin. The afterimage of the suspended space still clung to him. The sense of Marin's presence had not fully faded. It lingered under his skin like a vibration too low for sound but impossible to mistake, once felt. Ethan had seen the aftermath of Force visions before, usually on Marin. He didn't know their full mechanics, and he never pretended that he did, but he knew the cost. He knew the look of someone pulled too hard through something they hadn't gone seeking. He knew the body's delay in catching up afterward. And I'm gonna pause there for our ad break. Please go get yourself some water. I'm about to do the same. I will see you in a minute and a half. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. Also, thank you to my mods for taking care of that craziness. I appreciate you. Okay. Yes. Spam bots, go bye-bye. It's all good, don't worry about it. Somebody got it. That's all that matters. I know, that was the best part. A bot killed a bot. I love that. Alright. This is one of the reasons why Sarabot is wonderful, among many other things. Yes, a bot killed a bot, which is fabulous. Alright. Sit, he ordered quietly. The word carried more than command. In the moment that it landed, it took on the weight of Kash Veyran, unseen watch, the discipline of holding space without intrusion, of imposing steadiness where collapse might otherwise spread. He left only long enough to retrieve a bottle of water, pressing it firmly into Jared's grasp with the same practical force he might have used to seat a weapon in a younger Marine's hands after shock. Callista lowered herself to sit beside Jared on the permacrete, close enough that her presence became a boundary rather than a question. Her hand settled lightly on his shoulder, not restraining, not probing, just enough to anchor him. She asked no questions. She offered only steadiness. Jared took a sip of water, and then another. The shaking in his hands eased, but the echoes of the vision clung stubbornly, like pressure trapped behind his eyes. One moment he had been staring at the forest, the next he had been under it. Ooh, sorry. Pulled below the surface and into something that had not wanted to be seen, but had accepted witness anyway. Okay. Ethan, he said at last, his voice rough but controlled. Do you remember our conversation earlier? A small nod was Ethan's only answer. His left thumb brushed once across his knuckles, then pressed firmly into the center of his palm. Listening. Speak plainly. I am listening. Give the report clearly and without omission. Jared drew a longer breath and began. He didn't rush. He didn't embellish. That was not how he'd been taught to report, and not how he wanted this held. Yes. He spoke plainly, of the way the vision had taken him, of Marin's condition, of what she had chosen to share once the space between them had steadied enough for words. He described the resistance first, because that was what had mattered. Not absence, not loss. Resistance. The current had refused him and then taken him anyway. He described the industrial cold, the restraints, the Chiss woman, and the use of lightning calibrated to hurt without breaking Marin too quickly. He described the compound only as far as Marin had been able to name it from its effects. Statics, nausea, and the force turning jagged and punishing in her hands. He kept his voice steady even when the memory tugged, even when his fingers tightened around the water bottle hard enough to make it creak. Callista occasionally interjected, not to interrupt, but to give shape to a thing that Jared could feel without quite being able to name it. When he described the way Marin's awareness had folded inward and then opened elsewhere, Callista gave him the word for it. Suspension rather than severance. When he spoke of the way the memory accepted him but held him at a distance, she named it for what it was. Witness space. Much like Iran's experience, it was not a direct passage. Otherwise, she let him speak uninterrupted, dividing her attention between the meaning of his words and the strain, they left behind. By the time he reached Morandi, the hangar had felt even more still than before. He didn't dramatize that part. He didn't need to. He said that her name had been spoken, that dread followed immediately, that the shot came into the tent shortly after, and that Mirandy's body had hit her hard enough to pin her in place, and that he knew, not guessed, he knew that his death had been meant for her. Callista's hand tightened just slightly on his shoulder, then eased again before it became restraint. He continued. He explained about the lightsaber next, not repeating Marin's fear, but naming the risk nonetheless. The tracker, the crystal, the way the fracture had looked deliberate rather than accidental. The wrongness of it had traveled through the vision so clearly that he'd been able to feel it, even secondhand. She thought she was able to reach me because Cure passed close enough to the system, Jared said, the words settling carefully into place between them. I was able to observe her taking the saber apart in the vision, but we will not be able to confirm anything more until she's home. He extended his hand in front of him and took a moment to focus. The image formed slowly above his palm, a slowly rotating orange crystal, pale and fractured, with a single deep crack running along one edge. The light emanating from it was dimmer than it should have been, not because the projection was weak, but because the memory of the damage sat inside the image itself. She's worried it's dangerous to use now, Jared said quietly, even without the tracker. Ethan swore under his breath, the Mandoa low and sharp. Callista leaned closer, studying the projection. Her eyes closed briefly as she reached out with her senses. Not enough to force anything, but enough to test whether the pattern Jared described aligned with anything she already knew. Something shifted in her expression. It was not surprise, but recognition. Her right pinky curled once against her palm and tapped lightly at her thumb. Connection recognized. This links to prior known methods or doctrinal concerns. Ethan's middle finger traced a short arc over the back of his hand. Confirm origin. Confirm whether the pattern matches known precedent. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but edged. Etika, Bestine. Ethan's curse this time was harsh. Lek, I remember. For Jared's sake, Callista explained. Her tone stayed measured and exact, giving him only what he needed and nothing dramatic. It was a tactic, a pattern, an old method repurposed, something designed not merely to track, but to compromise by association. Not a bomb left on a path. A thing placed where trust itself would become the delivery system. Jared felt the blood drain from his face. You think they tried the same thing? And when she resisted, they changed objectives? Callista's nod was grim. Her hand closed slowly into a fist. Likely. Pattern fit is strong, though not yet externally confirmed. She turned to Ethan. What was their goal the last time they moved against Catan? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His mind was already moving, tracing lines, following threads, and connecting patterns towards the place where motive turned into the pattern itself. His thumb pressed twice into the side of his palm. Possible pattern repeat. Reassess target and intent. The Praxium, he said at last. And they failed. Callista's fingers crossed briefly, index and middle, and low enough to be mistaken for a shift of tension in her fingers. Course will change. Expect deviation from prior pattern. Hostile objective likely evolved after initial failure. Ethan's gaze snapped up, hardening. Nash, this isn't about the Praxium. His knuckles tapped twice against his thigh. This is personal. First they wanted information, now they tried to kill her for refusing. And if her saber had come back with her body... He cut himself off there, his jaw tightening. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sealed weight of Emberlock, knowledge contained, and named only by those cleared to hold it. What had been said here would not leave this space. What had been understood would shape everything that followed. Callista's attention shifted briefly towards the hangar threshold, then back inward. Her hand rose no higher than her lap. The thumb brushed once along the side of her forefinger and stopped. Silence maintained. Whole discussion inside the circle, no uncontrolled speech beyond those present. Jared sat very still, the echo of the thread still warm in his chest. He had not gone looking for this knowledge, but now that he held it, he would not set it down. He looked again toward the forest beyond the hangar threshold. The trees were darker now. The last edges of the light had gone thin between them, and the house behind him had become all quiet systems and held breath. It was not absence. It was not peace. It was watch. And in that watch, something inside him settled. Not because the danger was gone, but because it had finally taken shape. Someday survival is your only victory. That is enough. Jurza Creed, Maxim 20. There are no triumphs left to claim here. There are no clean endings, no words that make what was lost sit easier in the chest. There is only breath, heartbeat, and the quiet proof that you were still standing when you were never meant to be. Survival does not need to justify itself. It does not need to be brave or noble or loud. On days like this, being alive is the work, and that is enough. All right, my friends, and that is chapter 20. Yeah, we're gonna stop there for the evening. I do hope that you enjoyed the chapter. I apologize for all of the technical issues that hopefully I can sort out before the next stream. I'm grateful for each and every one of you who was here this evening, and I hope that you enjoyed and will come back for the next stream. So, have an awesome evening. I'm going to take a real quick look and see if there's anyone that we can go say hi to. Alright. Let's find out. Let's see. Yeah, I know. It's a bit awkward when you're coming in 2/3 of the way through the story. But hey, you know what? I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that you enjoyed, and hope to see you next time. It's I admit that it was a bit heavy. That's why I said you might want tissues. But it's not as heavy as chapter 18 was, that's for sure. But I am glad that we got through it, and we'll continue with the next chapter next time. I am going to go say hi to I'm taking a look at my list here. Alright. Alright, I have figured out who we're gonna go say hi to. I would greatly appreciate if you guys could hang around and go say hi to Foxy Nix with me. She is a fellow member of the Survivor Squad, and she is currently streaming the, I think the beta test for a game called Loftia. I'm not super familiar with it, but it's pretty new. I think, like I said, I think they're doing the closed beta test. Alright. For anybody who is subscribed to the channel, please feel free to grab that first raid message. And for anybody who is following the channel or just hanging out, please feel free to grab that second one. I will be live again on next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern with another foray into Stray. That is the game that we are currently playing, and I am greatly enjoying it. It's not a game that I have ever played before, but I am enjoying the heck out of it. So I hope to see you guys next Wednesday, and hope and pray that you had an awesome stream with me and that you have an awesome rest of your night. So let me get this raid going over here. All right. Alright, you guys, thank you so much again for being here with me and hanging out and kind of digging into the story a little bit. As always, if you're curious about the lore behind any of the stories, please come hang out with me in my writing workshops, which are every other Sunday, where I have been digging into the chapters from Steps into the Past and talking about the themes and the lore and kind of how it all began. Which, if you like that kind of stuff, please come visit me. I will see you guys again next week. Have an awesome rest of your night. Take care of yourselves and get some good rest.